Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. At this time, the Buddha was staying at the Veluvana monastery, and there's this Dhammapada verse that was uttered in relation to this Bhikkhu from that particular country, the Vajji country, and he was from a city called Vesali. So this Dhammapada verse number 302 is the Buddha's words around this, and the Dhammapada commentary gives us this story about this Bhikkhu and how he was standing out alone in the monastery looking down at the city that was all lit up as the people of Vesali were celebrating on the full moon day of Kartika a particular festival associated with the constellations. And so the whole city was lit up, it was brightly lit up, and there was a lot of festivity and merrymaking, singing and dancing from the festival. And the Bhikkhu was said to have been looking at the city from the monastery and feeling very alone, very dissatisfied with his personal circumstances. And so apparently he softly murmured to himself, "There can be no one whose lot is worse than mine." And at that instant, the spirit guarding the woods appeared to him and said, "Those beings in Niraya envy the lot of beings in the Deva world." And Niraya we know as hells. And then he went on to say, "So also people envy the lot of those who live alone in the woods." And having heard these words, the Bhikkhu realized the truth of those words, and he regretted that he had thought so little of the lot of a Bhikkhu. And so the next morning he went to see the Buddha and reported the matter from the previous evening to him. And then the Buddha told him about all the hardship in the life of all beings. And then the Buddha uttered this verse to the Bhikkhu: "Duppabbajjaṁ, durabhiramaṁ, it's difficult to go forth, it's difficult to be content. Durāvāsā, gharā, dukkha, the life of a householder is difficult and painful. Dukkho samāna, saṁvāso, to live with those who are unequal is painful. Dukkha, anupatita, addhagū, the traveler in samsara is afflicted by suffering. Tasmā, caddhagū, siyā, therefore do not be a traveler in samsara. Na ca dukkha anupatito siyā, do not be afflicted by suffering." So this is a very interesting verse to contemplate. And isn't this how we find ourselves? Like the same situation as this Bhikkhu. During these restrictions and lockdown, this particular Dhamma verse resonates for many reasons. Because we're like the Bhikkhu in many ways, that we're sat at home in restrictions, or in and out of restrictions, and we're looking out at social media, we're looking out into the world from the television when we're stuck, and we're looking at other parts of the globe, enjoying being able to come out of lockdowns or out of restrictions, being able to roam a little free. And so in many ways we can be like this Bhikkhu looking out in the world thinking, what is going on? Why are we stuck and unhappy and feeling quite restricted while there are other people out there able to roam freely and able to get back to life, so to speak? Or maybe we have been restricted from going to work and we see people around us being able to go to work, being able to put food on the table and earn money. And so when you look at the lines in this verse, it's very interesting. So the first line, the Buddha talks about going forth, that the lot of a bhikkhu, or in the case of also a nun, it's difficult to be content. And I think most of the time we don't see, even for people that ordain into the monastic sangha, that it can also be difficult. We forget that it can be also quite challenging for them when they are also restricted by 227 rules, 311 rules in the case of bhikkhunis. And we forget that initially when they ordain, having to go from householder life to monastic life is actually quite a challenge. It's only when the path starts to open up to them, that there's more wisdom, more saddha, more conviction towards the path, that it gets easier, that there is more contentment. When there is more concentration of the mind, that's the case. And that's equally applicable to lay meditators as well, that in the beginning, all the restraint of the senses, all the things that one does to follow the Buddha's instructions is initially very difficult. And so you find it very difficult to find contentment, because you're removing yourself from the world. You're not taking worldly pleasures. And so when you look at people taking worldly pleasures, you initially feel like you're missing out, until you're wise and you realize that actually there's danger there. So that first line is really a reflection of that. You wouldn't find Venerable Sariputta or any of the arahants feeling this way. And that is because they don't shake. They don't shake when the conditions change, or they're obstructed from something. They don't shake. They don't go with even the feeling of it, the loss of pleasant sensations, for example. And in the beginning, for those that ordain, it's different. And then you come to the line about the life of a householder being difficult and painful. I mean, this is a real reflection, because when things are good, it's very hard to see that we experience difficulty and pain. It's only when we age, when we get sick, when someone in our lives gets sick, or the same kind of thing, or someone in our lives, someone close to us passes away, that there's a moment of opportunity to see that this life is difficult, it's painful. Or sometimes we forget that those little things that happen, those moments, even little things of, having to pay bills, how difficult it is to pay bills, and thinking about how much money we have in the bank as a householder. Or when we have to deal with difficult people, and people that are being obstructive, maybe even quite aggressive towards us in different situations, whether it's at work or even going to the supermarket. Sometimes we can be confronted with very unexpected situations. Or maybe with our children, if we have children, where they're going through growing pains and hormonal changes, and for no apparent reason they can be quite upset with us and we don't know why. And likewise, when our parents are aging and they become quite difficult, nothing tastes good, they always want to demand certain things that we think might be unreasonable, or they don't want to listen to us when we're advising them about something. And so at every turn, it can be quite challenging when we actually look at it, when we're more conscious of how difficult it can be, particularly the survival needs. At this time, if one has lost a job, it's very difficult to actually almost like make things work, because if you have dependents, if you have bills, if you have mortgages and debts, you try and make everything hang together. And during this time, it's really quite obvious that there is dukkha, that is quite painful. And there's extreme difficulty when it's quite challenging, the conditions. But even then it can be so overwhelming that you can't even see it from a dharmic perspective. It overwhelms you at the survival level. And so Buddha Dhamma isn't there to steady the ship, to steady one's mind. Instead, of course, you're having to face things which are quite immediate and involve putting food on the table, keeping safe, or recovering from illness, or worrying about a loved one who is extremely ill right now. But it's also good to take a moment to understand the First Noble Truth of suffering. And it's one of those things that it's very difficult for us to want to keep facing the First Noble Truth. We find it quite difficult, and we deny that we've understood it correctly, or that we need to keep coming back to the First Noble Truth to activate right view. And that's a very difficult thing to see, even for the most advanced kind of practitioner, when you get to a certain point, you think, oh, I don't need to reflect on this anymore. But the truth is, it's very important to reflect on it in a very skillful way, to be wise around it, because this is what keeps you on the right path and practice. And to remove any kind of arrogance around whether we get the First Noble Truth correct all the time. Our conceit is what prevents us from looking at it, to humble ourselves to the conditions, being our teacher, that the Dhamma is right there in looking at it that way. So the third line goes, to live with those who are unequal is painful. And isn't that so true, whether we're monastic sangha or householders? Isn't it so difficult to live with others? That for many of us, at some point we get to the point, young and old, where we go, I just want to live by myself. This is just too hard. And the inequality is really the inequality in our view. So it's not the same. It's the inequality in our behavior. It's not the same. It's the inequality in how we speak to each other and deal with certain scenarios. When anything is unequal, what sets in is a lot of difficulty, because you're always colliding with each other. And this happens in monasteries. If you go and stay in a monastery, you see that it's not easy to get along. And when you live in the household life, it's also the same thing. There are annoyances, and then there are real big arguments, and then there are serious divisions. And this you can see in the world. So living in this world with everyone of different races, of different religions, of different ideas and values, it's very difficult. And this third line resonates from that point of view, to live with those in the world who are unequal, who don't have the same of all these things. It's very painful. We're constantly colliding with one another, whether we want to or not, we just collide. Even our most precious person that we live with, the longer we sit with them and talk, the more evident the oncoming collision comes. And so when you practice this path and you read about the arahants, that they don't shake, that they don't talk much with each other, only for the purpose of maybe teaching junior monks. They don't often have friendly chats in terms of frivolous chats. It's for this reason. It's knowing that one can collide. And when you know that there are different, at the time of the Buddha, there are different monks and nuns who would follow different senior monks and nuns. It's for the reason that like goes with like, same goes with same. So you found those that were interested in psychic powers, they were the ones that followed Venerable Mahamoggallana. Those that were, of the same kind of analytical ability of Venerable Sariputta, they would go with Venerable Sariputta. And then of course you would have all the various different senior monks, and then you would have Devadatta, who would have all the ones that had the same views and opinions and unwholesome kind of ideas as Devadatta. They would follow him. So then we go on to the final part of the verse. It says, the traveler, and this means that those of us who wander in samsara, we're constantly afflicted by dukkha, by suffering. And the Buddha says, therefore do not be a traveler in samsara, do not be afflicted by suffering. So this also is very interesting, is because what comes to mind initially for us to understand this is how when there is dukkha at the mundane level, whether we're monastic or whether we're lay people, we do indulge in traveling as a way out of dukkha. We sometimes don't see it consciously, that it may be for a good reason that we go to see our loved ones, or it may be due to a teaching engagement, a good cause, and one gets invited and one goes. Or it's literally, for householders, it's a holiday, a way to assuage all that hard work that one did at work and looking after family, and for children going to school, then you plan a holiday. And so what we learn from traveling is that if we're really honest and we really look at penetrating, just using this example, we travel at a very base level to get away from the idleness. That's one thing, the boredom. We also do it at a more extreme level to get away from the suffering of working, the suffering of our normal conditions, of the daily grind. Do we not think of it that way? And so what we're trying to do is get away from the pain of our existence and to find some pleasure in something else. So it might be in a different city, different experiences in that different city, different food experiences in that city. And so we're constantly having this idea, if we travel, then we'll be happy. And yet, when we actually look at the example of traveling, what happens is we realize, well, one, traveling comes to an end, so we meet dukkha again because we have to go back to our lives and our city, our home, and the daily grind. And also when we travel, it's not necessarily always pleasant. That when we deeply look at every single travel experience, there is dukkha even in that experience. And what we do is we try different foods, we try and make it better at each and every turn, even if something doesn't go quite right on our trip. We don't even notice that traveling through airports and having to go through immigration, being accosted with questions and things about where we're going and where we're staying and what we're going to do before we're allowed entry into a different country. Now it's even worse with this current situation. You need to have different passes, whether you've been vaccinated, and you need to have good reason. In some countries, you're not even allowed to enter, let alone leave. Some countries, since March last year, you're not allowed to leave unless you petition and apply to the government to tell them a good reason to allow you to leave. And then even for people coming back, even if they're citizens of that country, the same thing. There are some countries now requiring, even though your residence and your work is in a different country and you're a citizen of that country returning to see your parents or some reason like that, you can't leave just on a return plane ticket. You have to petition the government to actually be able to leave. Some of these different rules are coming into place. And so there's not always pleasantness in this whole situation. And it's very remarkable to look at it that way. Now, using that one example and knowing that when you travel, there's always this wonderful thing where you see your loved ones, if you're going to see your loved ones. And then when you have to depart, you feel the pain of that separation. And at this time, a lot of us are separated from our loved ones because of this inability to travel. We're not able to easily see our loved ones. We can only see them through Zoom or through one of the messaging apps, video conferencing. All the technology becomes very useful right now, but it's not the same as being able to see a loved one face to face in person. And so most of us have still been separated from our family members either since the beginning of last year, if not longer, if we hadn't seen them for a while longer than that. And it's painful when you're faced with that, and when you know that your parents are aging, they're in their 80s, they're in their 90s, your grandparents, if you still have grandparents, are also of those types of ages, and you know that you don't know whether they will survive this particular period of time. And so we're confronted with this difficulty. And what we know is that separation from them is extremely painful. And when we go into the sankharas, the stories about it, it gets even more excruciating to the point that we can be extremely upset. And when you look at this and you take it into what the Buddha says about when we pass away, that separation from what is loved, united with what is displeasing, it's like this, but on a grander scale. And so it's a real reflection that these particular verses, or these lines of this verse, are extremely powerful to understand what it means. to understand that the little dukkha that we're suffering right now, it gets worse, particularly when we lose this body, when we have to face what happens after death. And a lot of people are extremely doubtful about this because they don't have the insight into what happens after we die. And they don't, at times, have enough saddha towards Buddha, what Buddha is teaching, to prevent us from going down this path, prevent us from the whole massive suffering over and over again. And so when you go through this verse and use examples such as the ones that have been highlighted and other ones, it's good to see that even through a verse like this, when we're looking out into the world, thinking that it's better out there, that we're forgetting the whole predicament. We're even forgetting that the people out there who have relative freedom right now, they're all subject to old age, sickness and death. They all have challenges that we don't know. Financial challenges, worries about loved ones, worries about work, worries about what's going to happen after all of this lands, after all the vaccinations, after all the different things happen, all the different things that we don't know is about to happen. And so it's very good to look at it outward and inwardly, that we're all facing a great deal of uncertainty. We're all facing old age, sickness and death. We're all facing a lot of things that, if we see it very correctly, when we look out into the world, we don't think some people are doing better than us, like this monk, his example. And we don't lament over what we don't have. We look at what we do have. But we look at it very honestly as well, that this predicament is very real. Not just what we're going through right now with this current scenario and what it's playing out as, but overall, the larger context, because that provides some relief from all of this as well. If we can penetrate the Buddha's teaching, then there's a lot of fragrance there that helps us through this period, helps us to not entertain thoughts which are unwholesome, thoughts which are incorrect, that there's a lie in how we look out at the world at times. A good reminder is the Pariyesana Sutta about searching. And we've touched on this before when we looked at the 5 frequent contemplations, as well as separately, that we're very inclined to search for something that is always sliding. So the first ignoble search is when we're liable to old age, we're subject to aging, but we search for what grows old. So every time we search for food, every time we search for experiences, every time we search for people, there is aging in all those things. Decline, ripening, and we don't see that. The second one is we're liable to sickness, but we search for what gets sick. And that goes with things that we think about, things that we talk about, things that we do at a physical level. People have the nature to sicken. Ideas have the nature to sicken. Lots and lots of things like that. The idea of me and mine is a sick one. So every time we take these 5 aggregates as me and mine, we don't notice the change in them. We don't know that they're subject to dukkha, and we take it as me and mine. Again, this is something that is an ignoble search. And then someone who's liable for death, we search for what dies, and it's a similar thing. Everything that is conditioned is death-bound. We forget. And so we are constantly disappointed. We meet dukkha when we search for these sorts of things. And then the last ignoble search is someone whose nature is defiled, searches for what is defiled. And so this is leading away from the Noble Eightfold Path. It can harm us. There is danger. There's danger in all those things that we're searching for, that are sliding, that are death-bound, that are defiled. So one that does not search in this way is one that searches for something that doesn't age, that doesn't get sick, that isn't bound to death and isn't defiled. And that is how we understand Nibbana. Because the question always comes up, like, how do you really know what Nibbana is? And always when you look at the teachings of the Buddha points to everything that is changing, which is misleading us. We misapprehend for that reason, and we think there is value there. And we constantly meet disappointment. We don't get what we want, because it never lasts. It keeps changing. We experience the dukkha, and we can't take it as me and mine at that point. So how we recognize Nibbana is that which doesn't change in that way, which doesn't slide. And so we get glimpses of that in our meditation, when we access the jhanas, when we go to very steady mind states, and wisdom arises from those places. From that meditation, when the mind is very settled, that the bodily formations, the kaya sankharas, the vajji sankharas, the verbal, which includes vitakka vichara, the kind of mental chatter that we have, it quiets. And some of our mental volitional formations start to quiet as well. Not all of them, but most of them in the meditation starts to quiet. Then you really get to see a glimpse of Nibbana. And if you get to Nirodha Samapatti, you get a real glimpse of Nibbana, in the sense of something that's a lot more steady. And so that's what it's about, when you don't have to experience change, something that is changing, then Nibbana is something that will never change. And so the search is over at that point. And that's what we're training towards, to recognize that, to know that when all these formations, that's why we walk the Noble Eightfold Path, when they all cease, that's when we realize Nibbana. And so until that happens, we're still traveling. So this simile of traveling that the Buddha gives us is a very good one, because we like traveling, but we don't understand that traveling in samsara is like aimlessly wandering, roaming. And so you get many suttas where the Buddha gives different other similes about this transmigration, traveling process. One of them that we've covered before is the Asa Sutta in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 15, discourse number 3. And in this particular Samyutta, chapter 15, there's a lot of different similes given. And so in this one, it's about the flow of tears. The Buddha says, the flow of tears you've shed while roaming and transmigrating is indeed more than the water in the 4 oceans. For a long time, you've undergone the death of a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter, loss of relatives, loss of wealth, or loss through illness. From being united with what is displeasing and separated from the pleasing, the flow of tears you've shed while roaming and transmigrating is indeed more than the water in the 4 oceans. Why is that? Transmigration has no known beginning, no first point is found, of sentient beings roaming and transmigrating, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. This is quite enough for you to become disillusioned, dispassionate, and freed regarding all conditions. And so this teaching of the Buddha is actually very good to join with this Dhammapada verse that we're looking at. Very good to contemplate, even during this time that we're relatively stuck in and out of restrictions and lockdowns, to really look at the journey that we're taking, not just the journey that we like, that we think that we like, that we don't see the dangers from, but really look at this journey in samsara for what it is. If we have lost anyone during this time, how difficult that has been. if we've been separated for so long, well, at the end of our life, it will be like this. This feeling that we have, this inkling of a feeling that we have right now will be like this. Not to mention the loss of our own bodies at the time of death. So the Buddha really strongly encourages us to consider the journey in samsara, going from life to life. It's a constant theme in the Buddha's teachings, and to understand birth, aging, sickness and death. And it's a real boon if we can penetrate it, if we are reminded of it, if we take it seriously, not discount it, not just think of this as one life. Because if we do that, then we miss something very tantamount in the Buddha's teaching. And it is a loss for us if we do that. So that is why the Buddha says to look at the First Noble Truth as all these things, that birth is suffering, that aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness and despair are suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not getting what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. That's the thing. We tend to look at it in very small moments, what dukkha really is, what this suffering really is. But when we really look at it in this expansive way, to understand our predicament, it gives a very different perspective on what Buddha means by dukkha. And then a lot of the Buddha's teachings become much clearer why Buddha keeps going on and on about aging, on and on about sickness, on and on about death. Most of us spend a lot of time in sadness and sorrow because we don't understand this First Noble Truth. We despair, we lament. All we talk about is what is going wrong, because we don't understand this First Noble Truth. And so Buddha is always reminding us, particularly in this Dhammapada Verse, don't be that person that wanders from life to life, experiencing suffering. Cut it short. Enter the stream. Walk the Noble Eightfold Path, because that's the way out. The way out is not more suffering. You don't hear the Buddha saying, dukkha is the way to end dukkha. No, Buddha says the Noble Eightfold Path is the way to end suffering. Because what we're training to do is not to activate the paticca-samuppada, not to activate dependent origination. That's why we train in the Noble Eightfold Path. When we do the development of the Noble Eightfold Path, being able to cease our bodily formations by not killing, not stealing, not having sexual misconduct, by having right livelihood instead, right action instead, then we're able to stop our bodily formations. When we stop from wrong speech and make the right effort, so we have right speech instead and make the right effort, we're able to cease our verbal formations. When we develop the meditations, we have the intentions which are of renunciation, non-ill will, non-coveting. We are training ourselves so that we are able to cease our mental volitions. And Nirodha Samapatti is where we actually are able to stop the mind with the right view, because it is imbued with right view and the right mindfulness. We understand this body, we understand feelings, we understand the mind, and we understand all the Dhammas. It's safe. And when we look at it this way, when we train in this way, we're saying we're not going to activate the dependent origination. We're not going to construct through these formations, these volitional formations, because as we know from the Buddha, volitional formations, whether they're bodily, verbal or mental, they construct form as form, feeling as feeling, perception as perception, volitional formations as volitional formations, and consciousness as consciousness. When we allow it to establish, when we allow vijnana to establish somewhere, it's all over. We will be bound to keep doing the same thing over and over. So these contemplations are very useful because they help us to stop our tendency, our underlying tendency to this wrong kind of view and our volition towards it. So very, very useful to actually walk the Noble Eightfold Path. When you hear the Buddha's statement, he uttered this verse in the Paṭṭhāmakkhoti Sutta in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 56, discourse number 21. He says, because of not seeing as they are the Four Noble Truths, we have wandered through the long course in the various kinds of births. Now these truths have been seen. The conduit to existence is severed. Cut off is the root of suffering. Now there is no more renewed existence. So the Four Noble Truths, as we've heard, is really the sum total of what is really important about the teachings. They all feed into this elephant footprint of the Four Noble Truths. Dependent origination that starts with ignorance and leads to the whole mass of suffering fits within the Four Noble Truths. You understand how we constructed this body. You understand how not to construct another gross or subtle body. And if we don't understand and really penetrate the Four Noble Truths as the Buddha has originally taught, we will wander through many, many other lifetimes, many, many other births, and meet with dukkha at each and every turn. So it's very, very important to see that. Most of us think that we really enjoy traveling, that what we miss right now is traveling. But if you take that same idea and you look at this traveling through lifetime after lifetime, you start to realize that if you meet dukkha even from traveling in this mundane sense in life, if you're really honest to it, think about the airport scenario, think about what happens during your holidays, think about even if you have to travel for work. That sounds so glamorous, but in reality it's not really like that. There's lots of tiredness and burden and pressure. And then when you think about holidays, trips coming to an end, it's like when this body comes to an end and you have to see what happens next. It's the same kind of thing. And so this traveling analogy is very useful to penetrate, to see what the Buddha means by this. So these words of the Buddha really are encouraging us to really focus on the Four Noble Truths, to really penetrate them, to fully understand the First Noble Truth of suffering, to really abandon the tanha that comes with craving, the origin of suffering, to realize the ending of it through the development, the full development of the Noble Eightfold Path. When you really understand the Noble Eightfold Path, you see things such as anapanasati, the meditation on mindfulness of breathing. It's linked to the Four Noble Truths. It's linked to the development of the Noble Eightfold Path. If you meditate, you prefer meditating on the breath without the Four Noble Truths, without understanding how it's linked to the Noble Eightfold Path, it's not effective. It's exactly like what would have existed before the time of the Buddha. But when the Buddha taught the anapanasati, it was for anagamis and arahants. And that's because they had already developed a long way towards the Noble Eightfold Path. These developments in terms of ceasing bodily formations, verbal formations, and mental formations. That's what you are meditating on when you are doing anapanasati. Bhavita kaya, bhavita sila, bhavita citta, bhavita panya. Development of body, development of virtue, development of mind, and development of wisdom. So everything you see comes back to the Four Noble Truths. So the more time you spend in the Four Noble Truths, the better it is. And as a last point, I'll just touch on this diagram that we've seen before. If you remember when we talk about the Aditthhaparayaya Sutta, the one in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 35, discourse number 28, and also what appears in the Petthakopadesa, a longer version of this, is not to forget how we get to dukkha through Vedana. That constantly we are always changing our position. Even when we sit, we get sore. Even sitting in a chair, we need to get up and stretch our legs. If we're lying down, we need to turn over. If we're sitting cross-legged, we need to adjust the position. Likewise, when we're bored, we need to get up and go and make a cup of tea. When we are really overwhelmed after a long stretch of working, we want to take a holiday, go for a long drive, spend some time somewhere else. When we're, not happy with ourselves, we want to pick up the phone and talk to someone. All these things are really how we deal with dukkha. We are not steady when it comes to dukkha, the feeling of dukkha in particular. That at the feeling level, we need to fix it. We need to make it better. And so we go towards something that is agreeable. That's the first column. And what we find at the end of it, after that cup of tea finishes, after talking to that nice person, after going on a holiday, what we experience after all those pleasant feelings is painfulness and change, vipranama dukkha. And it's really disappointing, when you test this out in the meditation as well as just in daily life. You test it out and you realize, yeah, it ends and it's changed, and you experience dukkha at the feeling level. Same with the disagreeable object. When we're stuck at home right now, we're constantly with the disagreeable object. We're constantly living with the people that we love, but are difficult to live with because we have different ideas, different interests, different behavior, different views about things. And so it can be quite challenging. We're met with this disagreeable object. And maybe even the disagreeable object is the idea that we're not allowed to leave our homes. Maybe it's also the fact when we look in the mirror, we're not as vital as we used to be. We're aging even as we're stuck at home. Maybe one of our children is leaving to study abroad, and that is very painful right now. Or maybe you're having to leave your parents, your old parents, and return to another place where you live, where you work, because you can't stay with them. You have to go back to work. Or maybe the disagreeable object is knowing that you haven't seen your parents in a long time and they're 98 years old, and you are fearful that they may not survive this current situation that's being faced by the world. And so when you're with this disagreeable object, you end up in painfulness, in pain. That out of painful feelings, you end up in this dukkha dukkha. And then the neither agreeable nor disagreeable object is, even while it's good right now, that even if you have a few moments here or there that are just okay, they're neither really great and they're not really bad either. They're just more inconsequential. They're somewhere in between the two extremes. And so you don't really notice that there's any particular feeling around it. It's quite just normal. But then you meet painfulness in construction when maybe something in your house breaks down. It was working and then it breaks down. Or you are in meditation, but you slide from a really good meditation and you can't get to that meditation again because it's constructed. And there are many different small to large examples of the third line. But it's good to recognize that when we take refuge in feelings or our experiences, that we're met with these three different kinds of dukkha. And that's part of the other thing, outside of the bigger predicament, that when we still believe that we can trust the experience, we can trust our feelings, then we keep activating dependent origination. Because this is the part of dependent origination that through contact, it conditions feeling. And then feeling conditions craving. So when we think that out of any kind of feeling, there's something of value there, that's when we want things. And there's something much deeper than what we're talking about right now. But it's good to remember this meditation, that if you know this meditation, really meditate on it during this time. Because it's very helpful to see this truth about feelings, this truth about the experience, this truth about greed, hatred, and delusion. And there'll be a longer explanation about this meditation coming up. But as a initial thing, a reminder, and those that know this meditation, during this time it's very important to do this lobha, dosa, moha, this greed, hatred and delusion meditation, because the agreeable object line aligns with lobha, greed, the disagreeable object line aligns with dosa, and the neither agreeable nor disagreeable object aligns with moha. And so you really start to see what lobha, dosa, moha, greed, hatred and delusion is all about, and why it's very important to refrain from sense contact, because sense contact is what triggers off. If we make contact, then feelings can be expected, vedana can arise, any of these different three kinds of vedana. And if they arise, then tanha arises. And if that arises, then you've already activated the dependent origination. So we're training ourselves not to do that, because where does it lead? It leads to dukkha. So you can see that in this particular example, but you can also see it if you remember dependent origination. With the activation of any of the links, it all leads to the whole mass of suffering. So we suffer. So I'll leave this talk here. We can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be happy and well. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Teruan Saranai.